Now, what is challenging is actually the genotype, to understand what is the underlying genetic problem that the person carries. I'll just take a step back to understand what is it that we're talking about when we say genetic testing. So if you look at if we look at the entire human body is made up of cells, and the cells have genetic material called DNA. So the DNA actually carries a series of spellings or nucleotides. 3 of these nucleotides get together to form an amino acid, and these amino acids then get together to form proteins. Now, if we test all of us, each of us will carry spelling mistakes on these nucleotides. And that spelling mistake is called a mutation. So most mutations are harmless, but when the mutation occurs in an area of the gene that is useful for our day-to-day function, because, for example, in retinitis pigmentosa, there are over 200 genes that have been identified that can have mutations. So if we have a gene if you have a mutation that is very important for some functioning of the retina, and more importantly, if we end up carrying 2 copies of the mutation, that's when trouble begins with the mutation. Now, we all carry 2 copies of each gene. One comes from the mother, one comes from the father. This is very true, especially for the 22 sets of autosomes that we have. Now, for the sex chromosomes, we have the X and Y, whereas for the autosomes, you have 2 copies, one from one from each parent. Now, especially in families in southern India, there is still a concept of, while we have come out of the concept of consanguineous marriages, mostly, at least in the urban population, in the rural population, marriages within families is still the norm. So what happens here is the same mutation is running in multiple members of the family. So, for example, one of the marriages that is common is an uncle-niece marriage. The maternal uncle and the niece marriage is still prevalent in the rural population. So both of these, the uncle and the niece, carry the same mutation. Now, when 2 such people have a child, they have a chance of giving, unfortunately, the mutation carrying gene to the child, who ends up now carrying 2 copies of the mutation. So that's when the child gets affected or manifests the symptoms, because this is one of the very common questions that I am asked, saying, nobody in the family has this condition, doctor. How did my child end up getting this disease? Or how did I end up getting the disease when no one else has this? This is exactly how it happens. That both the parents are carrying 1 copy, but because they have another normal copy, they never really show up the clinical symptoms. Whereas when someone gets both the copies, they end up with the clinical symptoms. So these are called autosomal recessive diseases, and is one of the commonest ways that a retinal disease at least transmit across generations. There are other ways which are not very common with RP or LCA Stargardts. The commonest is the autosomal recessive mutation. So what do we now do in the lab? The lab will collect about 5 to 8 ml of blood sample, and then isolate the DNA and actually look for the mutation that the person may be carrying. Of course, the lab also will talk to the clinician to understand, so if we have identified this specific mutation, is this something that correlates with what you're saying, what the clinician is saying, and so on. So finally, they will release the results saying that this is a mutation report of the person. Now, why is this useful? One, it will help us establish, how severe the mutation is. Because to be able to tell someone that, look, you don't have a very severe mutation, you'll be able to manage your life till your 50s or 60s, is hugely different from having to tell them, you have a severe mutation, or your child has a severe mutation where there could be severe vision loss by the time they are 20. So that level of being able to prognosticate or sort of talk about the progression is very, very, very crucial for an affected person. So that's one. The second, of course, the population where we identify mutations mostly are where a couple wants to expand their family. That's one of the commonest reasons why people come for genetic testing. Either I have a problem, my wife has a problem, or someone else has a problem and therefore I'm worried, or they have one child with a problem and they now want to make sure that the next child does not get affected. So these are reasons why we do a genetic testing even if we're not able to offer an immediate treatment.